This is The Big Three from the Coalition for a Prosperous America with senior economists Mihir Torsakar and Andrew Reschenberg.
The phone in your pocket and the solar panel on your neighbor's roof started the same way. As quartz refined into gray powder called polysilicon, 99.999% pure. And roughly 93% of the world's supply of that powder now comes from China. Nearly half of the solar-grade material comes from a single region, Xinjiang, where Washington says production runs on forced labor. Two of the technologies that will define this century pass through one gate, and Beijing is the gatekeeper. And this month, for the first time, America decided to push back on the gate itself. So welcome to the Big Three from the Coalition for a Prosperous America, where each week we break down the three biggest stories shaping U.S. trade, industrial policy, and the American economy. I'm Mihir Torsakar, and this week I'm joined by Nick Iacovella, CPA's Executive Vice President for Public Affairs and Communications, as Andrew is out this week. So let's get to it. So the big story this week is the administration has rolled on its Section 232 investigation into polysilicon, and the remedy goes further than any solar trade action before it. So we have a 15% national security tariff plus minimum import prices, a first for any 232 covering the whole supply chain from raw polysilicon to finished modules, and it lands on December 4th. Polysilicon is the material underneath every silicon chip and virtually every solar panel, and China has spent 15 years cornering the market. And today, what Washington did, how China built that corner, and whether this action can bring the industry home is what we'll be discussing. So our guest today has litigated this issue for over a decade. Tom Beline is a partner at Cassidy, Levy, Kent, and has represented American solar manufacturers in most of the major trade cases of that period, including the circumvention case and the court fight that ended the 2-year tariff holiday that they were receiving. Last time Tom was on, we talked about Chinese solar firms angling for 45x tax credits through Hong Kong corporate structures, but now the fight is on the raw material itself. Tom, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
Right, so let's kick off the discussion right away. First, why don't we start by talking about what Washington just did? So there's a lot of layers to this proclamation. There's the tariffs, the price floors, etc. Talk us through, what you think, some initial thoughts about this proclamation, why you think this is unique.
Well, so you said it right away, right up with that this is a first in a long time that we've seen something where something like a minimum import pricing mechanism has been used. In the trade world, it's not out of left field. It's actually been used in other contexts. As you know, we've talked about anti-dumping and countervailing duties in the past on this pod, and I've explained, how those things work. And sometimes you can get what's called a suspension agreement in those cases where you can set a minimum import price. So the United States has used these to try to resolve trade frictions in the past, and so it's a nice to have in this space, but it's not exactly a new wheel. It's reinventing the wheel. Where it's done something new here that is different than in any other case is that it's looked at the entire supply chain and tried to really establish what you would have as a differential within each step of the supply chain. And I think it's doing so in order to provide some certainty for people to come back to the United States, invest in making these products here, knowing that you're not going to have a situation where you put a business plan together, assuming that the price in the market is going to stay at a certain level, only to have a surge of Chinese imports come in and crash those prices down, right? So what the minimum import price does throughout the supply chain is basically provide some certainty for investment in the U.S., where you can actually build out a business case to invest in something that may not become operational in the next quarter, but 8 quarters from now. So that's why it's particularly unique, because of the expansive nature.
Yeah, it seemed like the imposition of the price, the minimum import price, that it does things that a straight tariff can't do. So maybe you might have already kind of touched on this a little bit, but I think that was a really kind of, for me, a signature takeaway of this proclamation. And maybe if you want to elaborate on that a little bit, the import of that.
Yeah, for sure. So there's a couple of things that are going on here. So with our special tariffs that we've had under IEEPA, Section 232, Section 301, sometimes what they do is they actually incentivize a tariff cost sharing as between a foreign producer and the U.S. importer, where I mean, you and I have talked about this in the past where, in the initial China 301, in Trump 1.0, what you saw was, prices that were going up in the normal course. All of a sudden we put in place Section 301 tariff of 25%. Those prices then all of a sudden dropped by 25%. And it's clear that the Chinese were willing to take a bath to maintain U.S. market share and not increase prices, right? You can do that only for so long until it actually catches up to you. That's sometimes what happens with these special tariffs. And so what we have in this circumstance is we have the tariff buffer, but we also have this minimum import price floor, which actually has some teeth to it because it basically says you have to be at a minimum import price of, let's say on a cell, 22 cents per watt. Then you also have to certify that your first arm's length sale of that end product containing that cell, if the cell itself has to be at 22 cents a watt or higher, or the module that you're going to produce from that cell has to be at 38 cents per watt or higher. So it's basically setting in place a U.S. market atmosphere where the expectation is on the commercial side, where people are buying these products from unrelated parties, you're going to have a market price floor that basically sets that price floor at that level. And what I think this is intending to do is, everybody's trying to drive down costs. As you get to scale, you're going to be able to deal with cost increases because you can deal with fixed costs on a per unit level if you get to scale, right? You can reduce those, you can drive them down. And so in an environment where you get more companies onshoring here and getting scale in the U.S. market, you're going to have a situation where U.S. costs should be declining. Over the period of time, if you know that you can get your costs below what these minimum import price levels are, you have some margin built in there to compete with the imports. And so it does actually create a market opportunity for anybody who wants to invest because you could say, hey, if we can get our fixed costs down and we have to deal with some variable costs, of course, but if we can get our fixed costs down and get scale, we can actually be selling modules, making a profit. If we can get, costs down to 33, 34 cents a watt, you're going to be able to be, the pole position for selling those modules in the U.S. market. And guess what? Not only do you have that adder, but you have the OBBA and the IRA tax benefits that accrue because you've produced the good in the United States using non-fiat materials. And so it's really an opportunity that, I think the Commerce Department is saying, we're going to get into this space. We're going to create an industrial policy that actually generates onshoring activity. And if I could just bring it back to, the baseline of the proclamation. I mean, when you look at the proclamation the president's team put out, right in the first paragraph, it identifies what this is all about, right? In the space of a decade and a half, and you make me feel old here because, I was litigating these cases back, when we first brought the first solar cell case. I was in the government at the time in 2011, and it was a big deal as to whether we would even initiate the case because there was concern that China would immediately retaliate against our polysilicon production, which was the global supplier of polysilicon at the time. And what happened is they did. They basically put in draconian tariffs that hollowed out our polysilicon production. Well, polysilicon production is something what I would akin to, Major League Baseball, right? You want to be producing the best grade polysilicon that actually goes into the semiconductor industry. Every single time you're producing a batch of polysilicon, you want to hit a home run. Guess what? In baseball, if you hit 400, you're going to the Hall of Fame. And that's something similar that's happening with polysilicon producers. If you can get to 400 on the semi-grade, you should be doing really well. You should be printing money. The problem is, what do you do with the other 60%? That 60% needs someplace to go. Well, the 60% is actually a big deal when you think about it. And so having the ability to sell that here and get and wafer making facilities that can come online now here, and then have this whole solar supply chain here to sell that 60% of the polysilicon production, that's a big deal. And that says to companies like the Cornings, the Hemlocks, the Valkers of the world, hey, ramp up your production and continue producing polysilicon.
I love that you brought in baseball here because this is a perfect segue for opportunity for me to question our resident baseball player, Nick, to see if you had any questions. You see what I did there? That was smooth, by the way. But Nick, I wanted to give you a chance to weigh in with questions or any comments you might have.
Yeah, no, I'm a washed up baseball player now who tries to play golf, but no, I think what Tom is saying, is really important to understand that the whole reason why this is such an important 232 and the framework that we've seen is it does encompass the entire sector. And when you look at poly in particular, certainly they really tried to figure out what is the best way to accommodate this entire supply chain, acknowledging that the poly producers, they can make, chip grade poly, and that's phenomenal. We really want a chip sector, but what do they do with this leftover piece when China has so dominated the global marketplace for solar grade polysilicon? Not because they've out innovated us or they're better companies. It's simply because we have allowed them to do it either through a lack of enforcement or policy, and we've let them, undercut our market and our producers. So I think what's really smart here, and maybe, Tom, I mean, you've spent over a decade, I think, although he's still looking, very, very, very young, but it's your experience in this sector is extensive. I mean, you've been in the fights with these companies on the front lines, across multiple trade cases. You've seen firsthand what the Chinese can do, how they've gotten around some of these loopholes. What really stands out to you in this one? I mean, I know there's some concerns that we have around like the 120-day delay implementation. We saw stockpiling during the Biden years with the moratorium, but I think on the whole, Undersecretary Kessler and his team, they really presented here the most comprehensive framework we've seen. And we've heard from other members, this should be a model for other 232s, or, why didn't they do this for our sector? So what stands out the most to you? What do you think they really got right? What should we be watching for?
Well, so let me start with the first one, which, I think is something that might not be as obvious, but they tried as hard as possible to get the market price to be at these levels. And by that, I mean, they have set the minimum import price standard as what it is. So that's the value that actually needs to be declared when you enter the merchandise into the United States. And if you're not at that level, what they provided for is a specific tariff. And so when you think about it through the lens of what is the actual cost to me as the importer, so driving the cost elements, and this is going to be right up Mahir's line of thinking because I'm going right into economics, right? So, and this would be a great study to do. But you have a 15% that is applied on the entry value. And so intrinsically, as we just talked about with the special tariffs, when I think about offsetting any tariff impact, the first thing I think about is valuation. Could I reduce my entered value by a certain amount to offset the percentage? Well, guess what happens when you do it here? If you were to reduce the value below 22 cents per watt for a cell, to get away from the 3.3 cents that you would have to pay in the 15%, what you end up doing is actually adding an amount to get you back up to the 22 cents because they provided for a specific tariff that carries you up there. So let's say I reduce my cell import entered value to 20 cents per watt. Well, all of a sudden, my actual tariff impact is 5 cents because I paid 3 cents for the 15% times the 20 cents. And then I have a 2-cent special tariff to get me back up to 22. And so by reducing my entered value, I'm worse off from an importer standpoint. So that's the first thing, is that it's actually going to drive people to have to, bring their entered values up. And that's actually going to be an interesting proposition for some people, because then you turn around as the importer of record and you say, okay, I paid this much for the product. I'm going to need to turn some kind of profit in the U.S., right? And so they're going to have to turn around and sell it to the first unrelated supplier for maybe a half a cent or a full cent higher per watt, even though their related party, cost of production is much lower. So that's the first thing, is that the specific tariff actually has bite to it that I don't think people realize. I mean, the world is changing with that specific tariff because it's an absolute value of a cent each time you go down. It's not a percentage figure. So that's the first thing. The second thing is they have employed a certification regime that has been lacking in a lot of the suspension agreement contexts that I've talked to you about before. For years, we had a suspension agreement with Mexico in trade in tomatoes. It's a case that our firm has been involved in for a number of years. And when Assistant Secretary Kessler was actually Assistant Secretary of Enforcement and Compliance, we were often in there with our clients and explaining to him why the suspension agreement was working. And he would say, well, help me understand that, because we've set a minimum import price. Like, what's the problem? And we'd say, listen, come with us to the LA terminal market, and you're going to see wholesale tomato prices well below that minimum import price. So he gets it. What he understands is that it can't just be on the import side because, people are going to, move money around and do whatever. What they've created is this certification regime that requires you to certify to selling to the person related party. And guess what? If you don't certify or don't have the certifications, they're not just going to apply penalties like we saw with the people who violated the tariff moratorium in solar. What they're going to do is they're going to say, you can no longer import. That's as draconian as it gets. And so this is like the first time that I've seen them go to that level of a penalty, right? People would be fine, taking a penalty of, the full value of the merchandise they're found to be committing customs fraud. You commit some sort of violation here, which is simply not keeping a certificate or not supplying the certificate to CBP, you can lose your importation privileges, which means no more U.S. market access. So those are the two things that I would call out as particularly impactful with this one. And let me just comment really quickly on the 4-month rollout period. As somebody who lived through the Biden tariff moratorium, which was like the worst policy decision that probably was ever made with regard to, dealing in trade, because it set a red line of when it was going to end. So everybody was racing towards that finish line. We ended up having, a stockpile of merchandise here in the U.S. that far exceeded deployment of this stuff. I represent U.S. companies. I had Chinese companies calling left, right, and center saying, can't you do something about it? Because we're getting hammered on price because everybody is bringing stuff in. So like when the Chinese are saying the price is too low, that's when there's a real problem. But with this 4-month one, they've actually put in a provision of referencing anti-stockpiling. And why that is important is during the pendency of this 232 investigation, because of the uncertainty as to when it would drop, the trade was actually sort of holding back on projects. There was almost like this reticence to bring in a lot of merchandise to try to do something because the financing wasn't there. People were waiting on the sidelines to see how this one shook out because there's a lot of information going on in the atmosphere. Is it going to be 100% tariffs? Is it going to be this, that, or is there going to be shortage of things? All of this was going on, and so what you had was actually almost a flattening of importation behavior. You had new entrants come in, and so there are spikes and things, but it wasn't like you would see this like crest of a wave. And so because of that, I think what they've actually done is looked at those data and said, well, look, we're going to be able to see stockpiling because if we see an uptick that wasn't there before, that's going to be stockpiling. And so I think if you're an importer who is going to be, trying to race to get this stuff in before December 4th, I think there's a real problem that you're going to be facing that they're going to be looking at, very clearly. And again, that sort of Damocles over every importer's neck here about you can no longer import. Some of these companies don't just import cells and modules. They're importing raw materials to, produce here in the U.S. If you can't import that stuff, I mean, that's a real risk. And I think companies are going to take, a second to say, hold on, let's be mindful about what this all means.
Yeah,
Yes,
is it worth it?
Yeah, man, I think I think we got a good handle, I think, in that first segment about, what this action does. And it finally seems like it's got some teeth, it's got some enforcement involved in it. And I think we understand why, because of all the different ways that, these policies can be circumvented. So I thought it would be good to maybe transition over to the second segment, which was how Beijing, cornered the material in the first place. So just to give a lay of the land, China has produced like 93% of the world's polysilicon last year. 9 of the 10 largest producers are Chinese. One of their companies alone can make roughly 910,000 tons a year, whereas America's largest producer might make up like 35,000. And this is kind of a playbook that we've covered, which is pretty familiar to us at CPA. We talk about how China has built these choke points. But as an economist and the things that I learned in school, we talked about like comparative advantage and how, you just have natural endowments in one thing and you trade and all. It looks great on a textbook, but this to me isn't necessarily about a story about like, just natural endowments or comparative advantage. It seems like largely, of course, the product of policy. I mean, there's a reason why China is able to undercut, any, seller in the U.S. Because we are making this stuff. We do have, Hemlock Semiconductor. We do have Wacker, and these are these kind of policies that we have are needed to kind of keep them competitive. But talk maybe a little bit about how Beijing accumulated the resources to kind of build this choke point up. And we'll start there on the policy front.
Yeah, so I mean, the thing that China has that we don't have is they've got a single party system where the head of the government gets to determine what they do and what they focus in on. And so when you go back in time, as China entered the modern world and was led into the World Trade Organization, which meant we brought down all the tariffs worldwide on China, and they came into the fold of international trade, they developed what are called 5-year industrial plans. And these 5-year industrial plans would identify specific sectors of the economy that they wanted to engage in. And every single one of those industrial plans, if you read them, indicates a desire to be dominant worldwide. And that, I think, is a different animal than anybody else has ever seen in modern history of being dominant worldwide. I mean, when you think about like being dominant worldwide, I immediately go into like a World War II thing, like dominance in the skies, like it is battle cry type of thing, right? This coming in the context of economic policy, I look at it as battle cry type of thing there too, which was we are coming out into the world and we're going to take advantage of this. So if you go back, I think into 2006 is when you first start to see polysilicon and the polysilicon sectors enter into these 5-year plans. And so what you have over the period of time is that there's a message from the top that says, these are the areas that we're going to focus in on, and we're going to do everything we can to support them. Well, what do they do to support it? Well, if you want to build a factory in China, you can get land for free from some of these industrial zones. They'll give it to you for free. You don't pay rent. You pay no rent. You don't have to buy the land. You get it for free. Some will say, okay, you come into our industrial zone, we'll give you electricity for free. And they can do that because it's all coal-fired power. So really, really cheap stuff, really, really dirty stuff, the stuff that's causing pollutants in the air constantly. Ironically, they're saying, don't blame us because we're doing all this green energy stuff. Yeah, well, you're building it with the most disgusting material possible. And so what they did was they were able to do that to help prop up and start their industry. But then that wasn't enough because they couldn't compete with U.S. know-how. So what they did was, over the course of time, they started to take on things like chip manufacturing, which was sort of like the downstream of poly. And the polysilicon producers here in the U.S. had to sell into the Chinese market to make those chips. Well, all of a sudden, there was 100% tariff on U.S. polysilicon. And so we lost the biggest market in China. So they basically did stand up their stuff, make somebody, available for the know-how, learn U.S. ways, then protect the market by cutting out the U.S., and then creating a built-in market structure for themselves. And the way that they do that's the most, I don't know if you want to say diabolical, but I'll go there, is that they want to have the entire supply chain be dictated by their companies. And the reason why I say it's diabolical is because if you go back to 2018, you had a period of time where you had new technologies in cell production for generating more power from the sun's rays. And these were, sort of like moving in parallel. There was like the baseline stuff, and then there was like the more advanced stuff. Well, China saw what was happening, and they said, well, hold on a second, like, we're going to pump the brakes on this thing. And what they did was they went to the equipment manufacturers and said, stop making the equipment to make those specific size cells for that technology. You need to start making equipment for bigger wafer making for bigger cells for a different technology. And so they basically changed the entire trajectory of the marketplace by having the ability to make the equipment to do the cell production. Like, that's where it's so like mind-blowing, right? And how do they do that? They all get in a room and talk, and they say, you're going to do this, and you're going to do that, and you're going to do this. If you go back 2 years where we had this massive glut of production in the world market of solar, you had basically China having weekly meetings with the major companies saying, you're going to curtail production this week. You're going to stand down production. You're not going to hire. You're not going to produce. You're not going to do this. And then the other thing is they have the wherewithal to be able to stand up the demand sector. So even though they were telling people to curtail production, they basically were installing, all the solar fields, all throughout China. But I'll tell you what, hardly any of them are actually connected to the grid. And they're not connected to the grid on purpose, because they're basically saying, we're going to find somewhere to put all this stuff to have, production to be able to stand up this. But we're not going to undermine our coal-fired power plants, because that's what drives our competitiveness in every other sector, including, aluminum and steel, and be able to undercut the world prices there. So, it's a really interesting history over here. I mean, I think we could probably spend hours talking about those 5-year plans, but it really does go back to, baseline 2001, when China was let into the WTO and the world market was open to it.
Yeah, and I guess, what... Oh, I'm sorry, Nick, did you want to jump in? Or
Maybe, I think just one of the most interesting points about this is so different from what we're used to seeing, in the U.S. and maybe even in European markets. But it's really important for policymakers to understand that, when we're designing policy in the U.S., whether it's trade policy, industrial policy, it's always with, the mindset that we want these private companies to be profitable. And if they're driving profitability, they're able to invest, they're able to grow. With the Chinese, they don't care about profitability at all. They simply care about capturing global market share. And I think it's why a lot of our policies have failed to, not necessarily failed to make an impact, but certainly failed in the past to deliver the kind of results that were promised of them. And I think what is so unique about this new poly proc, and maybe as we wrap, we should think about what can we judge its success by. But it's clear that Commerce and the Trump administration with this one is really thinking about, we're recognizing that China doesn't care about profitability. They'll drive the price down as much as possible to have access to the U.S. market. And they responded with a framework that I think accommodates that in a completely new way, to keep them out of the U.S. market where they can really undervalue product. Because as Tom said, if they undervalue the product, they get hit with a specific tariff that's very punitive. If they import at the MIP level, then I think we have to judge, are the MIP levels at the right spot? Is everything working? But, maybe just as we're looking towards, the future of this, and I do think, this will be heavily judged if it's successful or not, because there's been so much policy around solar, in particular on trade. What are things, we obviously represent the entire supply chain, of manufacturers at CPA, from poly all the way through to module. I think when we talked with Commerce, they really wanted to see cell and wafer investment. But, as someone who's been in this sector longer than we have, Tom, I mean, what are you looking for to see? Is there certain trade things you're looking for on import levels or pricing or investments? Is it all of it? Give us a little preview.
Yeah, so the first thing I'm looking for is the minimum import price that's carried through to the market price going to stick? And by that, I mean, the first concern that I have stems from my history in ag. And it's, that tomatoes example, right? Let's say I caught the guy with the tomatoes selling them below the minimum import price. Well, next week, what he's going to do is he's going to be selling tomatoes bundled with green peppers. And I'm not going to be able to show where the offsets are there. And that's, I think, the major concern I have is that, we need to be thinking about what does enforcement look like if we all of a sudden see a Chinese company that acquires a installation or distribution or a developer, and they can basically bundle to the first unrelated party the whole kit and caboodle, right? And all of a sudden you go from 38 cents per watt for a module down to like a blended price with installation and everything like that that is far below that. And I'm not sure how visible that will be in order to be enforced. And so that's an element that I think, baseline we've gotta be talking about enforcement there. The second thing that I think is is this going to be successful, is really can we close the donut hole in the supply chain. And the biggest donut hole right now is ingot growing and wafer making. And people might not think this is particularly special because all you're doing is you're taking the polysilicon, you're putting it into like a lab structure, you're growing this beautiful ingot, and then you're using a laser slicer to slice that into wafers. And, you'd sort of like shrug and say, okay, like how hard is that? I mean, from the technology perspective, it's not. It's the machinery. Where it gets really hard in the United States is that we have a regulatory environment that doesn't like a lot of water usage that, is not necessarily going into, consumption by, animals or people or things like that. And wafer making and ingot growing takes a lot of water. Also takes a lot of energy. And the environment that we're in with new AI data centers, those energy costs are going up. And so from a U.S. policy perspective, are the differentials where you've got $100 per kg equivalent for wafer to 22 cents per watt for cell, is that delta significant enough to incentivize the wafer making to come online? Because that's really the biggest problem that we have right now. We can't really control our own destiny because you've got to go offshore for wafers. And just as I said with regards to the equipment example from 2018, you also had wafer changes over the course of the 2010s where China was constantly changing the wafer sizes, which dictate the cell sizes. So we can get away from having to rely on others for the wafers. That's where I think this policy can also be successful. And the final thing I'll say, I mean, does this go far enough? The supply chain for a bill of materials to produce a solar module, a solar cell, includes a lot of materials that we probably want to have produced here in the U.S. I mean, I think the people who produce extruded aluminum, like they produce great things. I mean, you bought a boat in Florida, like half of the stuff there is extruded aluminum. I mean, we want to have the ability to make some really nice stuff here. Well, solar frames are in that space. And guess what? Steel is actually a great framing technology too with some of the stuff that, the companies are doing in the steel sector. So is that an area that we should be talking about protecting? The other thing is, things like paste and electro material, inverters. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that goes into the bill of material that are things that are sensitive and go into technology elsewhere. And so it's something that we could be thinking about. China is the dominant supplier of silver paste in the entire world. Could we have silver paste production here? I don't know. I mean, we've got the ability through mining to have that, including if our relationship with Canada gets resolved this week with certain trade deals. There's opportunities there for silver paste. It's almost like I'd like to have a Fortress North America idea with respect to these types of articles. And that's where I'm wondering if a version 2.0 of this, if we start to see things work well, includes more of that bill of material.
Yeah, that's a great point. We actually have the aluminum extruders, and they used to make these frames for the solar sector, years ago, and we saw that their ability to provide this profitably, where they weren't being undercut. We saw that go away fairly quickly once, we saw the trade protections sort of degraded on the aluminum side. But I think there's a lot of interesting things you said there, and really getting into something, maybe a little foreshadowing of something that we've been talking about, which is there's all this energy generation happening. It's not just the solar panel or the natural gas turbine, but it's all the different pieces that go into it, the copper wiring. Could we see some type of energy generation 232? There's a huge boom happening in the AI space. We've seen, a huge demand for more gigawatts to the grid. I think we're importing like 80% of the equipment to do energy generation. And, why wouldn't we want to make more of that here? And I think really the huge benefit to all that is we start to see this web of like interconnectedness where the industrial sectors, overlap. It's not just solar, but it's aluminum, it's steel. A company like, Next Power, formerly Next Tracker, right? Incredible company building a whole bunch of stuff. They're a technology, they're a steel company. They're building systems for utility scale solar, but they use all of our members' materials. I think they purchase steel from our member companies. These are the kinds of companies that are benefiting from this type of policy, right? It's not just the solar manufacturer, the poly producer, so the jobs being created really spread out.
Well, not only that, I
So,
mean, one of the things that you often hear from opponents of solar is that, it only works when the sun's shining.
mm,
Yeah, that's true up until you get to battery storage, because
right.
battery storage is the key that unlocks the ability for solar to be a 24-hour supply source, right, from an electricity perspective. And what you see at a lot of these new builds is that actually battery storage is, in fact, being, built into the whole premise of what's going on there. And that actually makes a lot of sense just from an energy policy perspective, because just like in solar, nat gas, you'll see fluctuations over the course of a day, hourly. You'll see fluctuation in the price of nat gas. Well,
So,
that does drive some impacts through the supply chain. And if you got to battery storage at scale here in the US, which I would like to, I think that's like the next frontier of what we need to do here. You get the benefit of having these sources be a little bit more constant, because you can draw from those at these larger electricity intensive programs like an AI data center. You can have solar on the roof. You can have that augmented with nat gas, and it all goes into a battery storage facility that's like literally right next door to you, and you can draw power through the day, through the night. And guess what? I guarantee you, if we got there, everybody who is looking at their electricity bills now from the consumer perspective would say, "Holy cow, my electricity bills are going down," because we would then all
absolutely.
we would then have it all make sense. There would be a stasis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was thinking like, so we've covered a lot of ground. I wanted to move us to the third piece, and Tom, you kind of mentioned a little bit, raising the question about like, will this work? And I wanted to step back for a second and think about, from my vantage point, I think about a lot of the policies that have been implemented to try to limit China's rise in this space, because of, whether it's anti-dumping, countervailing duties that, and you dated yourself a little bit. I'll date myself a little bit. I was at the ITC during the time when a lot of these trade cases were happening, a lot of these 80 CBD duties coming out, and happened to see just like how China was really adept at circumventing these rules and just uprooting production and moving it to a different jurisdiction. All of a sudden it's in Southeast Asia. And then even seeing, you mentioned the I think it was the 2-year holiday on Southeast Asian panels that we then allowed to happen. And there's been some policy inconsistencies that we've had. So I get back to the question of like, will this work? How important is it to, number one, just be on the same page, whatever administration we have in place, the consistency of focus on this issue, and then also just appropriately leveraging the tools that we have to try to really just kind of limit this kind of activity, this kind of malfeasance that we're seeing from China.
So let me just put it really simply: no loopholes, right? Like,
Yeah.
once you create a loophole, that loophole will be exploited. And here, you may remember that from your time at the ICD, we for years we didn't have a safeguard because of the way that the World Trade Organization reacted to the way we applied the safeguard measures. And when the Trump administration said enough, we're not going to have, you know, 6 unnamed bureaucrats in Geneva tell us how to interpret our laws, we all of a sudden had the ability to bring safeguard cases again. The solar safeguard was one that was an opportunity. And by that I mean, you know, there was the ability to instill some discipline in the market. Safeguard remedies have a lot of different benefits to them. There was a tariff rate quota as well as a tariff, and it was universal in application for the most part. The exceptions were, you know, for developing countries, and there we didn't really have a lot of the whack-a-mole problems until a couple of years into the safeguard, when all of a sudden Cambodia, you know, known solar powerhouse Cambodia, came onto the scene, not because they were really good at the technology, but they were excluded from the safeguard as a developing country, quote unquote. The next thing that happened, though, was that we excluded from the safeguard what were called bifacial panels. So this is where you generate electricity on both sides of the panel. That was pushed by big energy companies who said, this technology doesn't exist in the United States. Well, had anybody picked up the phone to call one of the longest running U.S. producers in Oxen Solar, Oxen would say, here's 3 different projects we just did on bifacial panels. And so once they excluded bifacial panels with this pitch by the energy company saying they couldn't get it, all of a sudden you had a situation where the Chinese were essentially painting the bifacial panels black in order to put them on a roof and still call them bifacial panels, even though they were only like on a roof generating electricity from one side of the panel. And so the summary of all this is no loopholes. We can't have them. And so like the reason for this 232, why it's so great, is that no developing country loophole. So you're not going to go and be able to go to, you know, where China's going now in Africa to, you know, set up a module making facility using all Chinese built material and then ship it to the U.S. That ain't going to happen now to avoid this measure. B, we're not going to exclude any product, right? You can see here, this is modules writ large, cells writ large. Like nothing is called out as an exemption. And I think if you're, you know, if folks were listening to this, come to DC and they go to the White House and they mention the word exclusion, it's like saying a 4-letter word to your grandmother. Like you're gonna get slapped for doing it, right? We're not talking about exclusions anymore. We're having these universal tariffs. And so those 2 things on their own should address some of the things that we've had happen in the past that undermine the remedies that have been put in place. Lastly, though, I think what is so important is that we have a continuity in policy. You know, in the United States, for better or worse, we have lots of process for people to say, I don't want this facility in my backyard. I don't want you to build this new facility. I need to get permission to get this type of electricity, this type of water. It takes time to get these things up and running. To have this go into place in December of 2026, and then if we have a change in administration and all of a sudden in the middle of, you know, 2030 or after we have all this stuff pulled out from under us, you know, we're going to be in a worse off position because there's going to be companies who are going to say, you fooled me once and yet I still made an investment and then you fooled me again. And I think that's where, you know, I think the risk is that, you know, in 2029, you know, and early 2029, if there is a switch in administration, there's going to be this impulse, especially in solar for some reason, this impulse to side with like the installation side of the business. And I'm hopeful that we have the full calendar year of 2027 and all of 2028 to prove everybody wrong that having minimum import prices is not going to be ruinous for the industry. It's not going to put people out of jobs. In fact, what I'd say is it's going to give more opportunity for more jobs. It's going to provide more opportunity for investment in the United States. Some of the money that's sitting on the sidelines is going to come into the sector and say, let's put a solar cell facility in one of these states that we can rely on to be supportive. Let's put in a wafer making facility because we've got you know, the ecosystem set up. And you know, I think from there, if we have that happen, what I would hope is that the people who are all for green energy look around and say, you know what? this is green energy through and through. It's not dirty coal. It's not international shipping. It's not benefiting from forced labor policies. It is truly, getting back to what America created in the 1950s when we first came up with this technology and then mastered it in the 2000s before China stole it from us.
Yeah, at the top of the show, I called Beijing the gatekeeper of this material, and August 6th, the proc was like the first action aimed at what we call the gate itself. So the whole chain is being tackled at once instead of one case at a time. And Tom, I think before we let you go, I wanted to ask you real quick, what's the one thing you'd want our listeners to take away about this action?
So over the course of a number of years, I've been arguing for tariffs on solar cells and modules, and I have received a lot of hate mail. I've been told that I am in the pocket of big oil, that I want nothing more than, a dirty life. I want nothing more than, 3 centigrade of increase to the global temperature when, 1.5 is accepted as too much. What I would say is what I'm in favor of is having the ability to control our own destiny, having good paying jobs in areas of the country that have been forgotten in some respects and looked down upon in other respects. And there is dignity in work. What I will tell you is when I travel to visit clients in all sectors and I get to go to a factory, it's one of the best parts of my job, honestly, because I get to sit and talk with people who I may never come across in my life in the normal course of the day. They're working really hard jobs. I'm lucky to be in an office in Washington, D.C. But when we sit down and talk about it, what I hear from them is, we just want a level playing field. If you give us a level playing field, we're going to work just as hard. We're going to actually make better product because we care. And you know what? We want to be able to walk down the street and see that solar farm that, the municipality is putting in be U.S. made product. I want to drive down the highway and I want to see the cranes that I help build that are helping build infrastructure here be U.S. made cranes and not foreign cranes. Like, there's something about the dignity of putting your hands on something and making something and then seeing it in reality and being able to look at your kid and feel good about what you're providing for them and saying, that's what dad and mom made today. Like, that's what we did. And that's what I would say to everybody who's listening is that, if we make it here, we're going to be better off for it, health-wise, work-wise, personality-wise, professional-wise. Like, we're all going to be better for it. And you know what? If we can all sit down and understand that, if we have jobs in this country and we're making things in this country, we'll be able to have dignity and look at each other. I guarantee you that all of us who have kids are going to look at our kids and say, we've definitely done right by you. And that's where I come at this.
Yeah, I love that.
Well
I
said.
love that. Yeah, you got me fired up to get back to my desk and do some work this evening. And I'll tell you what, just as a real quick reminder, I don't think that the folks, in China can necessarily look at the labor force in Xinjiang and say that sort of pride and the dignity that you just mentioned and the importance of that, because like they're robbing their workforce of dignity, and all in the name of getting a lower price, polysilicon and all the other products that they're putting out there. So. I had to throw that one in.
Isn't that something that's nice to have here too? Like, let's like one step back. We've created a minimum import price for the United States. Okay, what that means is that you no longer have to force somebody to do labor. You can pay them. You can actually pay them more when it's the dirtiest stuff in the world. And so, for all the people on the left who want to, have, say that this president goes too far in this space, goes, way down the line too far in trade, is not thinking about it. There's a person who is being forced to do work to build this stuff in the worst conditions. I mean, there are some of the materials that go into this are sometimes really nasty materials. And wouldn't it be great knowing that you can sell this product for 22 cents a watt for a cell or 38 cents a watt for a module and be able to say, you know what? I could pay that person a couple more RMB per hour because, all of a sudden I've got this space because the market is correcting itself. We're no longer in this unfair market where I also need to be unfair to my people. And so, you bring up a really good point that there's hope, I guess is what I would say with this. And that may be the best thing to say about the 232 program.
Yeah. You're not just paying a wage, you're investing in communities. I mean, there's a multiplier effect to all of this. It's so critical. Tom, Beline, thank you. Of Cassidy, Levy, Kent, thank you so much for joining us. Nick, thank you for pinch hitting. Again, got to throw in the baseball reference for those who were following. So learn more about our work at prosperousamerica.org. And be sure to find us on YouTube. You can check us out, The Big Three, on Apple, Spotify, and Google, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you.